Budapest, Hungary, 1956. A factory worker clocks in at 7 a.m., the same as every morning. He operates the same machine, produces the same quota, collects the same wage. The man next to him works half as hard, gets the same wage. The man on the other side has figured out a way to double output, gets the same wage. By 1960, the factory is producing less than it did in 1955. Not because the machines broke, not because the workers got lazier, because the system had surgically removed the one thing that makes human beings productive. The reason to try. Every generation rediscovers socialism the same way. They look around at genuine inequality, inherited wealth, stagnant wages, unaffordable housing, healthcare that bankrupts families, and conclude that the market has failed. That a more rational, more humane system of distributing resources must exist. That if the state simply took control of the commanding heights of the economy and directed production toward human need rather than private profit, the injustice would dissolve. It is not an irrational conclusion. The problems it identifies are real. The suffering it responds to is real. The intentions behind it are, in most cases, genuine. But good intentions and sound economics are not the same thing. And economics, unlike politics, is not moved by sincerity. It responds only to one thing: incentives. Every socialist economy in recorded history has collided with this fact. The collision is always the same, only the speed varies. In 1920, Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises published an essay that the socialist world spent the next 70 years trying to disprove, and ultimately confirmed. His argument was precise. In a market economy, prices are not just numbers on a tag. They are information. When the price of copper rises, it signals scarcity. Producers respond, substitutes emerge, consumers adjust. Nobody coordinates this. Nobody plans it. Millions of independent decisions flow through the price system, and resources move, imperfectly but continuously, toward their most valued uses. Socialism eliminates this mechanism. When the state owns the means of production and sets prices administratively, the signal disappears. What remains is bureaucratic guesswork dressed as planning. Friedrich Hayek, who later won the Nobel Prize in economics partly for extending this argument, identified why the problem is unsolvable rather than merely difficult. The information required to run an economy efficiently is not just vast. It is dispersed, scattered across millions of individual minds, embedded in local knowledge that no central authority can extract, aggregate, or process in time to act on it. The fisherman knows which waters are running low. The textile worker knows which looms are wearing out. The grocer knows which shelves empty first. None of this knowledge can be collected into a ministry and turned into a production schedule. The market aggregates it automatically through prices. Socialism destroys the aggregation mechanism and substitutes political judgment for economic reality. The result is mathematically predictable: shortages of what people need, surpluses of what nobody wants, and an economy that consumes increasing resources to produce decreasing value. This is not ideology, it is information theory, and the historical record is its proof. No economic experiment in history was larger, more ambitious, or more thoroughly documented than the Soviet Union's attempt to run a modern industrial economy without markets. For 70 years, Gosplan, the Soviet Central Planning Agency, attempted to manage an economy spanning 11 time zones, 300 million people, and millions of distinct products and services. At its peak, the planning apparatus employed hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats producing 5-year plans of extraordinary complexity. The early numbers were genuinely impressive. Soviet industrial output grew rapidly through the 1940s and 1950s. The space program worked. Mass literacy was achieved. Western economists debated seriously whether the Soviet model might outpace capitalism. But the calculation problem was doing its quiet, inevitable work beneath the statistics. Consider what happened when Soviet planners set nail production targets by quantity. Factories responded rationally by producing millions of tiny, lightweight nails that met the numerical target while being useless for construction. When planners switched targets to weight, factories produced a small number of enormous, unusable nails. The hardware stores remained empty either way. This was not corruption. It was not stupidity. It was the logical response of rational actors to a system that had replaced meaningful price signals with arbitrary planning metrics. Multiply that dynamic across every industry: food, housing, medicine, clothing, transportation. And you have the Soviet economy by 1975. Technically functional, practically disintegrating. Innovation stopped because innovation requires risk. Risk requires incentive, and incentive requires the possibility of personal reward. The Soviet engineer who developed a breakthrough manufacturing process received the same salary as the one who developed nothing. The farmer who produced a surplus had it confiscated. The factory manager who improved efficiency faced no competitive pressure to do so and no personal gain from the effort. Mediocrity became the rational strategy. And a nation of rational people responding to irrational incentives produces exactly what the Soviet Union produced by 1991, an economy that could no longer feed itself, a state that could no longer sustain itself, and a collapse that required no external enemy to trigger. Mises published his warning in 1920. The Soviet Union confirmed it 71 years later at a cost of incalculable human suffering. If the Soviet collapse was slow and grinding, Zimbabwe's economic destruction was swift and almost surgical in its precision. In 1980, Zimbabwe was among the most agriculturally productive nations in sub-Saharan Africa. Known as the breadbasket of the continent, it exported food across the region. Its commercial farming sector was sophisticated and efficient. Its future appeared genuinely promising. Then, beginning in 2000, President Robert Mugabe's government launched a land redistribution program, seizing commercial farms from white landowners and redistributing them to political allies and war veterans, most of whom had no farming experience or equipment. The calculation problem activated immediately. The knowledge embedded in those farming operations, soil management, irrigation scheduling, crop rotation, market timing, could not be transferred by handing over a title deed. It existed in the minds and practices of the people who had spent decades developing it. When those people left, the knowledge left with them. Agricultural output collapsed. A country that had exported food began importing it. By 2008, Zimbabwe was experiencing the second worst hyperinflation in recorded history, 89.7 sextillion% annually. The central bank printed $100 trillion notes that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Surgical equipment disappeared from hospitals. Teachers abandoned classrooms because their monthly salary couldn't cover a week's food. The mechanism was identical to every other socialist collapse. Destroy the price signals, eliminate the incentives, substitute political directives for economic reality, and watch the system consume itself. Zimbabwe's breadbasket became a basket case. Not over decades, over a single administration. Cuba offers a different and in some ways more instructive lesson than either the Soviet Union or Zimbabwe, because Cuba did not collapse dramatically. It simply froze. When Fidel Castro nationalized the Cuban economy after 1959, the island possessed genuine assets, an educated population, a functioning middle class, proximity to the world's largest consumer market, and agricultural infrastructure that made it a significant sugar exporter. Within 2 decades, it was dependent on Soviet subsidies to survive. When those subsidies ended with the Soviet collapse in 1991, Cuba entered what the government called the special period, a euphemism for what independent analysts described as a near famine. GDP contracted by roughly 35% in 3 years. Average caloric intake dropped so severely that the population lost measurable body weight as a demographic statistic. Electricity was rationed to a few hours per day. The government's response was to tighten controls, not loosen them. Dissent was criminalized. The black market, which was simply the calculation problem reasserting itself through informal price discovery, was prosecuted as a threat to the revolution. 6 decades later, Cuba's physicians rank among the best trained in the hemisphere. Its hospitals have no medicine to dispense. Its universities produce engineers and scientists who immediately seek employment in any country that will take them, because the Cuban state salary for a physician is the equivalent of roughly $20 per month. $20 in a country where basic consumer goods are priced at international market rates. The talent is there, the knowledge is there, the institutional structure that would allow that talent to generate and retain value has been deliberately prevented from existing. That is not a failure of resources. It is a failure of incentives. The same failure, expressed in the same way, that has characterized every socialist economy in the historical record. The most powerful argument against socialist economic planning was not made by its critics. It was made by its most consequential practitioner. In 1978, following decades of Maoist economic policy that had produced catastrophic famines and systemic stagnation, Deng Xiaoping introduced a set of reforms so fundamental that they amounted to an implicit acknowledgement that the previous system had been wrong at its core. He reintroduced private property rights. He permitted entrepreneurs to retain profits. He allowed prices in certain sectors to be set by supply and demand rather than central directive. He opened special economic zones to foreign investment and market competition. He did not announce that socialism had failed. He did not need to. The reforms spoke for themselves. The results were among the most dramatic in economic history. Chinese GDP grew at approximately 10% annually for 3 consecutive decades. Somewhere between 800 million and 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty, the largest and fastest poverty reduction in recorded history. That outcome is sometimes cited as evidence that socialism works. It is the precise opposite. Every percentage point of that growth came after China moved away from socialist planning and toward market mechanisms. The growth did not happen under Mao. It happened under the reforms that dismantled Mao's economic system. China's success is a monument to the power of prices, private incentives, and market coordination. It is also, inescapably, a confession that the system it replaced was producing poverty. For those who prefer controlled conditions, history provided one. In 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel. Two states emerged from the same nation, identical in culture, language, history, ethnicity, and starting economic conditions. South Korea adopted market economics, private property, and integration into global trade. North Korea adopted centrally planned socialist economics under a succession of authoritarian leaders. 70 years later, the divergence is visible from space. Satellite images show South Korea blazing with light at night. North Korea is almost entirely dark. South Korea's per capita income is among the highest in Asia. North Korea's is among the lowest on Earth. South Korean citizens are measurably taller than North Koreans, a physical record of the nutritional difference between the two systems written into human biology over generations. Same people, same starting point, same peninsula, different economic systems. The experiment has been running for 7 decades, and the result has not changed. It will not change, because the mechanism producing those results, the presence or absence of price signals, private incentives, and market coordination, has not changed. This history would be merely academic if its lessons stayed safely in the past. They do not. The mechanisms that destroyed the Soviet economy, Zimbabwe's agricultural sector, and Cuba's professional class are not unique to explicitly socialist states. Price controls, elimination of competitive incentives, state management of resource allocation beyond the capacity of any bureaucracy to execute efficiently, and chronic spending beyond productive output. These are not relics of Cold War ideology. They are policy choices available to any government, and they are being made in degrees across the developed world today. When governments set prices below market clearing levels, shortages follow, whether the government calls itself socialist or not. When taxation and regulation make productivity unrewarding, productive activity declines, whether the country flies a red flag or not. When states spend structurally more than their economies produce and borrow to cover the gap indefinitely, the arithmetic eventually asserts itself, regardless of the political label attached to the spending. Margaret Thatcher identified the terminal logic precisely. Socialist governments eventually run out of other people's money. The timeline varies by the size of the accumulated wealth being consumed. The destination is the same. The consistent failure of socialist economies across every culture, continent, and century it has been attempted is not a product of bad leadership, foreign interference, or insufficient ideological commitment. Those are the explanations socialist movements have always offered, and they have always been wrong. The failure is structural. It is built into the system's core mechanism. Eliminate prices, and you eliminate the information system that coordinates economic activity. Eliminate private incentives, and you eliminate the motivation that drives productivity. Concentrate economic power in the state, and you create conditions where that power will be abused, not because the people holding it are unusually corrupt, but because concentrated power without market accountability always produces the same behavior. Human nature cannot be abolished by political will. The desire to benefit from your own effort, to keep what you produce, to make your own economic choices, these are not capitalist inventions. They are features of the human animal that predate any economic system. Socialism doesn't eliminate them. It suppresses them at enormous cost until they reassert themselves one way or another. The Hungarian factory worker who stopped trying in 1956 was not a failure of character. He was a rational human being responding correctly to a broken set of incentives. Every socialist economy has been full of rational human beings responding correctly to broken incentives. That is why they all end the same way. The mathematics are not political, they are not negotiable, they are simply, consistently, indifferently correct.